Hello, BookTube. I thought we'd take a little stroll through the Boston Sunday Globe. I was at the corner store much earlier today, and the they have a little array of newspapers, big fat Sunday newspapers there, and I can't get the New York Times anymore because the New York Times came out on its op-ed page in favor of a fascistic military takeover of the United States, for the United States being run by the military instead of the civilians. And although they sacked the editor who ran that op-ed piece, they haven't apologized. They haven't, as far as I know, come out and said, no, we're not actually in favor of the executive branch sending in armed federal troops in order to crush civilian protests. They haven't actually apologized for that or said that's not their stance. So I had to just pass right over the New York Times book review. The New York Times, even though it has the book review, which is something I miss reading. But there were other Sunday papers there. The Boston Herald. Boston is right now a 2-newspaper town. Used to be 3 newspapers. The Boston Globe is sort of the New York Times. The Boston Herald is sort of the New York Post. And then we had a very prosperous, very good independent, the Boston Phoenix, which folded, unfortunately. Had some terrific writing. The Phoenix was always worth reading. So now we're a 2-paper town, and there's something a little silly about a big, expanded Sunday edition of the Boston Herald. How many exclamation points can you fit in one newspaper, after all? So I got the Sunday Boston Globe, and I thought we'd take a stroll through it together, and we will try not to concentrate on all the bad news, even though the front page article, this is a huge piece, very well done, by David Ebel, Laura Cremaldi, and Steve Enier. It's a long piece. It jumps to the inside of the paper. It's very, very good. And it's about the conflicted emotional reactions being experienced by the victims of the Boston Marathon bombers over the fact that Dzhokhar Tsarnaev's death sentence, the one brother who lived and who was caught and who was tried and sentenced to death, his death sentence has been overturned. The one remaining Tsarnaev brother's death sentence has been overturned. So unless lawyers for the prosecution can win another appeal, he will spend the rest of his life in jail, in prison. And naturally that had all sorts of psychological ripples for his many, many victims. And this team of Globe reporters does a fantastic job. It's a very well done article. It's infuriating for me on personal grounds. I don't care how dreamy this kid looked when he was in high school, and I don't care how friendly he was when he was stoned in Boston suburban backyards. He knew what he was doing. He built 2 pressure cookers with his brother. He was not an indoctrinated zombie. He was personally involved. He hid those pressure cookers and waited until there would be a crowd of civilians all around them. And then he detonated them and smiled and laughed as he made his exit. And we know this because he's on camera at the time, smiling and laughing. And then there was the usual sordid fallout from that. If you lived in Boston at the time, you absolutely will remember every minute of it because the city was on lockdown. The city was on martial law as police looked for these people who had been spotted, who had been photographed, and who were at large. And the very last thing that anyone in Boston law enforcement wanted during those tense days was for those 2 to show up somewhere else, for them to escape the city. So in that sordid aftermath, the older brother died. He was shot, and then he was run over by his younger brother. His younger brother accidentally ran over his body with a getaway car. And the brother was shot as well and escaped into a suburban backyard boat. Somebody had his boat under a tarp in the backyard. And this kid crawled under the tarp and was just hiding, bleeding, in the boat. And it was his trail of blood as much as anything else that led the police to him. And he was apprehended. I remember the Boston Marathon bombing mostly for 2 reasons. One, I saw the absolutely surreal video footage of Hollywood-style bomb blasts going off directly across the street from my library. And 2, it's when I discovered Twitter. It's when I discovered that I had an account, but it's when I discovered the power of Twitter. most of you know Twitter, quite rightly, as an acidic cesspool of hatred and hot takes and doom scrolling originated from what, because looking at your Twitter feed can, and I would argue is designed to make you feel worse and worse and worse in a way that is extremely addictive. I know plenty of adults who can't stop being on Twitter, and I know plenty of young people who've never known anything except life on Twitter. Who knows what kind of gun and bomb wielding psychopaths it is incubating? But one thing that it can do that absolutely has no parallel anywhere in the history of the world is something I experienced during the Boston Marathon bombing, which is that you were getting firsthand accounts of people in real time. The Boston Marathon bombing was the first time that I was ever updating Twitter every 5 seconds for the latest in a particular news feed. We had people saying a bullet just came through my window wall and lodged in the cabinet, and they post a picture of it, or there are sirens out directly down outside my window. Is this part of the manhunt? And they will show the sirens. It was the immediacy of eyewitness news without any network news filters is incredible. That was one reaction to the Boston Marathon bombing. The other reaction probably won't come as a surprise to a lot of you here, which I advocated it at the time. I advocated it when the manhunt was in progress. I advocated it when this was all going down on Twitter. Live, second by second, this was happening on Twitter. It wasn't anything after the fact. We knew when the police suspected that the remaining gunman was alive and in that tarped-over boat before they had opened it, before they had approached it. We knew before then that they suspected that one of these bombers was in that boat. And at the time, my reaction was the very first law enforcement official who opens that tarp and finds this helpless, skinny, floppy-haired kid begging for his life in English should say, sure, everything's okay, here, can you stand up? And once the kid was standing, that law enforcement officer should have put 5 rounds in his head. I said at the time, that's justice. That's not retribution. That's not vigilantism. That's not knee-jerk. There is no doubt. By this time, there was no doubt at all that this young man did this crime and laughed about it, smiled as he was walking away from the carnage his explosion was already causing. We know that he did that. Never mind the Clarence Darrow crap about the law and better that 10 guilty men should go free than 1 innocent man. No. Surveillance cameras and in the moment cell phones and surveillance feeds remove that kind of thinking. They update it. It is no longer useful to say the alleged perpetrator if you have the perpetrator on video live committing the crime. You're no longer slandering him to say that he did it. You're no longer serving any useful purpose by saying alleged. Everyone knew by the time the cops found this kid under that tarp that he was guilty of injuring hundreds of people and killing people, including a boy who was blown in half while he was cheering at a great sport event. My opinion at the time was that the first law enforcement officer to reach him should have put 5 rounds in his head. Once that didn't happen and he was taken into custody, once he stood for his original arraignment trial, my opinion was, okay, when he's in the courtroom, the court officer should wait until he's seated, unholster his gun, walk up behind him, and put 5 rounds in his head. What is the use, in any way, ethical, moral, practical, of allowing him to live with 3 hot meals and a safe, isolated room and all the reading material he can use until he's 80? What is the good of doing that? And I still ask that question. Of course, I'm never going to get an answer, because if this has been overturned once, then it will be overturned every time it's imposed. So he is not going to be put to death. Much less executed. What I was suggesting was better than he deserves. What he deserves is to be put in a concrete bunker with a homemade pressure cooker of the kind that he labored all night long to build, knowing that it's going to go off, and knowing that it's either going to cut him in half or mortally injure him, and then watch him bleed out. But let him experience what he put other people through. That would be the right way for him to die. But now, it's not going to happen at all. He's certainly not going to be allowed in a general population in prison, so no one's ever going to execute him in prison. And no prison guard is going to risk their pension, their benefits, their retirement package that their family and their loved ones and their grandparents rely on to execute him in the manner that he deserves, which is to bring him his breakfast and put 5 rounds in his head. So instead, what we're going to get is periodic stories like this. When he turns 50, there'll be another story like this, where Globe reporters talk to the relatives of all of his victims, or they talk to his victims themselves. And they're all over the map about their emotional reactions to, it doesn't seem right. One of them said, just let him rot and let's forget about him and all be better off for it. Others have said, we don't have the right to take his life. The state doesn't have the right to take his life. And one person quoted in the article said my own thoughts, which is if this can happen, if this doesn't get you the death penalty, then what does? Then what does get you the death penalty? If this isn't worth it, if this doesn't constitute a capital crime, that you spent all night working on pressure cookers, that you hid them in a big crowd of civilian onlookers, that you waited until they exploded and then laughed and giggled on your way away from the carnage and killed people in an attempt to escape justice, if that doesn't get you the death penalty. Anyway, that was the main story on the front page of the Globe today. Of course, it got me all outraged. There's also a story here about virtual truancy, because lots of classes are happening online. And so the question is arising, what happens when parents aren't making their kids take these classes online? What happens if something inappropriate happens? You've got these Zoom cameras in 80 million homes all over the country. What happens if somebody walks in, if an adult walks in with no shirt on? Or is playing TV in the background? Or is cursing in the background? Or doing something else in the background? Because Zoom is yet another reflection of the economic inequalities that are laid bare by schools closing in the first place, which is one of the things that is ideal for Zoom conversations, is a modicum of privacy, is your ability to control your home environment to the point where a Zoom participation is possible. And a lot of kids can't do that. A lot of kids don't have that home environment. So that was interesting as well, but we'll move on to the Metro section. The Metro section had 2 articles of interest. The first one is about Boston schools preparing to deal with the fall, preparing to deal with the new school season, and leaving open on the cards the fact that COVID-19 could surge or change. We don't know. So making a hard, fast rule about what school is going to be like in the fall in Boston is a little silly. But there was also the fisherman's feast for the North End. It's an old procession that happens in the North End. There was a lovely article about that as well. And then in the idea section, the idea is sort of editorials, that sort of thing, freewheeling, spitballing type stuff. There's a great article by David Schaffenberg called "Where Has All the Music Gone?" In which he writes about the fact that Boston has traditionally been an incubator for a huge number of bands who went on to become very popular, bands and performers who went on to become very popular. And what has happened to that? Where is all that? It doesn't seem to him like it's as alive as it could be. And then we'll finish up with the Sunday arts. We could finish up with the comics section. The comics section. The Boston Globe has a comics section. Not a lot of Sunday newspapers do anymore. But this would only be a cause for another rant, because the Sunday section, the very first comic right there is Doonesbury. And the Doonesbury comic this time around is funny, but downright painful. so if it's downright painful if you are one of this country's tens and tens of millions of Republicans who are sane. Republicans who are not Trumpist cult members. Republicans who actually signed up for their party because of its planks, because of its beliefs, and have watched those beliefs just get thrown out the window. Every single one of them. Deficit hawks? No. Executive overreach. Does the president get to act like a king? No, he doesn't. Well, but in this case he does, yeah? In this case we will run a deficit. In this case the president will praise debt. The value of character, personal character, that's a thing of the past. The comic tackles that squarely, and that's tough to read. That's very tough to read. But the arts section is all about movies and TV and local theater, and it also has a book section. It's not a standalone book section, but it is dedicated to books anyway. And there are 2 main reviews. The first one is about a review of Summer by Ali Smith, by Charles Finch. who writes the Charles Lennox murder mysteries. You've seen him on this channel before. I've praised those books enormously. And the other standalone book review, the other standout original art full color book review, is a review of Tales from the Ant World by Edward Wilson. Yeah, it's the ants' world. We just live in it. Look at the ants coming to dinner. And they're also the wallpaper. And this is by yours truly. So, talk about ending on a happy note. My review of Edward Wilson's book is in the Sunday Globe, and that's a thrill. That's an absolute thrill. I will cut this out, artwork and all, and put it in my copy of the book. And if I remember, I should remember to do this. I really should, because this review has been up online for a couple of days. If I remember, I will leave a link to my review. But it's always a thrill. It's been a while. It's been about 10 years. It's always a thrill to be in the hometown newspaper. That is just great. That is just fantastic. And the fact that I'm side by side with an author whose books I really like, reviewing a book I really liked, makes it all the better. So there you go. That was a little tour through the Boston Sunday Globe. It won't happen too often, although I have to admit, it's been a while since I read the Boston Sunday Globe, and I've forgotten how charming it is, how much I enjoy it. As an alternative to the New York Times, it might be a valuable thing. A few of you have asked, a few of you still remember that I used to take a walkthrough point by point of the Sunday New York Times. I can't do that anymore until they apologize for being A-OK with the fascist overthrow of the government. Then I don't want to read them. It's not enough for me that they sacked an editor who did that, especially since the sacking was completely equivocal. When that's what it should have been about. It should have been, well, we're firing you because you ran this editorial. It was a busy week. We weren't watching every single thing you did. You ran an editorial by a fascist American elected official saying, send in the troops. Crushed civilians. Crushed them. They oppose the leader. So you're gone. Not only are we gonna take the editorial down from our website, but you're gone, of course. Clean out your desk, you fascist piece of scum. They didn't do that. They gave him an equivocal soft landing firing, and they also haven't apologized. So I'm not going to read them, but maybe the Sunday Globe might be a thing to go through. One way or another, we'll see. I just wanted to take you through a bit of the news. I'm going to wrap this up, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.